The chambers of the Galaxy Council had stood for 11,000 years. Carved from the heart of a dead star, its walls shimmered with quantum-etched recordings of every session, every vote, every declaration that had shaped the known universe. The chamber was circular, vast enough to hold the representatives of every sentient species that had achieved interstellar travel, and at its center burned the flame of accord, a plasma construct that had remained lit since the first treaty was signed in the early days of galactic civilization. There were 742 seats arranged in concentric rings. Each seat was sized and shaped for the species it represented. The Vrenthar, towering crystalline beings from the scorched worlds of the outer spiral, sat in seats that looked more like architectural supports than chairs. The Lysara, delicate insectoid creatures with membrane-thin wings that fluttered even in the vacuum-protected atmosphere of the chamber, perched on alcoves carved into the upper tiers. The Dorvek, massive armored quadrupeds whose homeworld boasted gravity 3 times galactic standard, occupied reinforced platforms near the floor. And then there was seat 117. It had been empty for 6 months now. Ambassador Kale Voss of the Vrenthar Council noticed it every time he entered the chamber. His crystalline body refracted the chamber's light as he turned his elongated head toward that vacant space, the absence of it pulling at something deep within his processing core. Not guilt, exactly. Vrenthar did not experience guilt in the way organic species understood it, but something adjacent to it. Something that registered as a persistent error in his predictive algorithms, a variable that refused to resolve. The delegation from Terrasol remains absent, announced Overseer Tinnick, a small, pale creature from the bureaucratic world of Velpraxis. Tinnick's voice carried through the chamber via neural translation matrices, rendering her words in the native cognitive framework of every species present. This marks the 183rd standard day since the Human Dissolution Declaration was filed. Per Council Protocol 447.9, I am required to ask if any delegation wishes to petition for the reassignment of seat 117. Silence followed. 741 representatives shifted, clicked, hummed, resonated, or otherwise occupied their spaces without speaking. Kale Voss did not speak either, none of them did. It was not that the seat was worthless, far from it. Humanity's inclusion on the council had been one of the most contentious decisions in galactic history, and their seat carried weight that belied the relatively short time they had held it. The seat represented 700 billion souls spread across 12 star systems. It represented industrial capacity that rivaled the combined output of the Outer Spiral Alliance. It represented military capability that no one in the chamber fully understood, because humans had never been required to demonstrate the full extent of it. It represented, in ways that most representatives were only beginning to understand, the thing that had been holding the galaxy together. But no one petitioned for the seat, not because they didn't want it, because they knew what asking for it would mean. Overseer Tinnick waited the prescribed 47 seconds, then moved on. The Human Dissolution Declaration had been 3 words long. We are livings. No explanation, no negotiation, no list of grievances, no formal request for separation under Council Protocol 223, which governed the orderly withdrawal of member species from galactic governance. No transition period, no framework for the handover of human-administered systems, territories, or obligations. Just 3 words transmitted on every frequency simultaneously from every human vessel, station, and settlement in the galaxy, and then silence. Absolute, unprecedented silence. In the 6 months since, not a single human signal had been detected beyond the borders of what the Council now designated the Terran Exclusion Zone, a spherical region of space approximately 40 light-years in radius, centered on Earth's star. Every human ship had withdrawn into that zone. Every human station had either been abandoned, dismantled, and towed inward, or simply gone dark. Every human embassy on every Council world had been vacated overnight. The staff gone, the buildings locked, the lights off. The speed of it had been terrifying. Kale Voss had been one of the first to realize just how terrifying. As head of the Vrenthar Intelligence Directorate, he had access to monitoring systems that tracked the movements and communications of every significant military and commercial asset in the galaxy. On the day the declaration was broadcast, he had watched 17,000 human vessels alter course simultaneously, not sequentially, not in response to cascading orders relayed through a command hierarchy, simultaneously. As if every ship had received the same thought at the same moment and acted on it without hesitation. It had taken the Vrenthar supercomputers 4 days to confirm that the maneuver had been coordinated through a communication network that did not use any known transmission medium. Quantum entanglement, the Vrenthar scientists had suggested. But quantum entanglement communication was theoretically impossible at that scale. The humans had apparently not received that memo. Or Kale reflected as he sat in the council chamber and listened to the drone of routine proceedings. They had simply decided that theoretical impossibility was not a sufficient reason to stop trying. That was very human of them. The first crisis came 3 weeks after the withdrawal. The Cathara system, a mining hub on the border between Vrenthar and Dorvac space, collapsed into civil war. It had been on the verge of collapse for decades, held in check by a human-mediated peace accord that everyone had assumed was maintained by the Council's authority. It was not until the shooting started that anyone thought to check who had actually been enforcing the accord. The answer, of course, was humans. Not officially, the peace accord bore the Council's seal and the peacekeeping force stationed in the system War Council insignia. But the force had been 70% human. The command structure had been human. The intelligence network that identified emerging threats before they became violent had been human. The negotiation framework that had kept the Cathara factions at the table for 30 years had been designed by humans. When the humans left, the peacekeepers left. The intelligence network went dark. The negotiation framework became a dead document that no remaining species knew how to implement. Within 3 weeks, the Cathara mining stations, which produced approximately 12% of the galaxy's refined thallium alloy, were burning wreckage. The refugee crisis spilled across 3 sectors. The Dorvac mobilized their fleet not to restore peace but to secure their mining interests. The Vrenthar did the same. The Lysara, whose delicate physiology required thallium-based medical compounds, began to die. The Council debated for 11 days before passing a resolution condemning the violence. The resolution accomplished nothing. Kale Voss watched it all from his intelligence hub and thought about Seat 117. The second crisis came 2 months after the withdrawal. The void rift at the edge of the Andrasta sector had been dormant for recorded history. It was a tear in the fabric of spacetime, a wound in reality that periodically leaked radiation and dark matter in quantities that made the region hazardous to navigation. The Council had placed warning buoys around it 6,000 years ago and considered the matter closed. Humans had not considered the matter closed. Kale discovered this when his intelligence analysts detected an anomalous energy spike emanating from the rift. When he pulled the historical data, he found that the rift had been showing increasing instability for the past 200 years. The warning buoys had been recording this data the entire time, but no one had been analyzing it because no one had been tasked with analyzing it. Humans had been tasked with analyzing it. A small human research team had maintained a station near the rift for 60 years, studying the phenomenon, running models, and quietly filing reports with the Council's scientific division. The reports had been flagged as low priority by the Lysara administrator who managed the division's intake queue. They had been archived without being read. The humans had not complained. They had simply continued their work, updated their models, and refined their predictions. Their final report, filed the day before the dissolution declaration, had been titled Andrasta Void Rift, Imminent Expansion Event and Recommended Containment Protocols. It had been archived without being read. The expansion event, when it came, consumed 3 star systems. The rift tore open across a region of space approximately 2 light-years in diameter, swallowing everything within it, planets, stations, ships, and the 12 billion souls who had lived on those worlds. The energy wave that preceded the expansion sterilized 6 additional systems. The Council convened an emergency session. Kale Voss sat in the chamber and listened as representative after representative demanded to know why the scientific division had not warned them. The Lysara administrator, visibly trembling on her perch, produced the archived human reports and displayed them on the chamber's main holographic projector. 200 years of data, 60 years of detailed analysis. A precise prediction of the expansion event, accurate to within 3 standard days. Silence fell over the chamber like a physical weight. The humans knew, said Ambassador Torvac of the Dorvac, his deep voice resonating through the floor of the chamber. They knew and they told us and we ignored them. They told us for 200 years, Kale Voss said quietly. No one responded to that, there was nothing to say. The third crisis was the one that broke Kale Voss. It came 4 months after the withdrawal, and it was not a crisis in the way the others had been. It was not sudden, violent, or dramatic. It was slow, grinding, and systemic, and it affected every species in the galaxy simultaneously. The supply chains collapsed. This should not have been possible. The galaxy had functioned for thousands of years before humanity joined the Council. Trade routes had existed for millennia. The economic systems of the major species were ancient, stable, and well understood. Humanity had been part of this system for less than 3 centuries. Their departure should have been a minor disruption, easily absorbed. It was not a minor disruption. Kale's analysts spent weeks mapping the supply chain networks before they understood why. The answer was not that humans controlled critical resources, they didn't, not primarily. The answer was not that human ships carried the bulk of interstellar freight, they didn't, not in absolute tonnage. The answer was not that human financial systems underpinned galactic commerce, they didn't, at least not officially. The answer was logistics. Humanity did not dominate any single aspect of the galactic supply chain. Instead, they had woven themselves into every aspect of it simultaneously, in ways so subtle and pervasive that no one had noticed. Human software managed the routing algorithms for 40% of the galaxy's freight traffic. Human-designed communication protocols handled 60% of cross-species trade negotiations. Human-engineered docking systems were standard at 70% of major space stations. Human-trained logistics officers staffed critical positions in shipping companies, port authorities, and trade ministries across dozens of species. None of this had been imposed. None of it had been part of a grand human strategy to seize control of galactic infrastructure. It had happened organically over centuries because humans were very, very good at logistics. It was, Kale realized, what humans did. Not war, though they were capable of that. Not science, though they excelled at that too. Not art or philosophy or diplomacy, though they contributed to all of those fields. Logistics, the quiet, unglamorous science of making things work. Of connecting point A to point B in the most efficient way possible. Of seeing a complex system and understanding not just how its parts functioned individually, but how they interacted, where the bottlenecks were, and how to smooth them out. Humans had been doing this since before they achieved spaceflight. Their homeworld had been a chaotic patchwork of competing nations with different languages, different currencies, different regulations, and different standards. To function as a global civilization, they had to become experts at navigating complexity. And when they reached the stars, they found a galaxy that was exponentially more complex and applied the same skills at a galactic scale. They had done it so quietly, so unassumingly, that the rest of the galaxy had taken it for granted. The freight arrived on time, the negotiations concluded successfully, the docking ports functioned smoothly. Of course they did, they always had. Except they hadn't always, they had only functioned that way since humans arrived. Now the humans were gone, and the galaxy was learning what happened when you removed the connective tissue from a living system. Freighters arrived at stations that couldn't process them because the docking software had been designed by humans and no one else knew how to update it. Trade negotiations collapsed because the translation matrices, human-designed, human-maintained, developed glitches that no one could fix. Supply routes became inefficient as human-optimized routing algorithms were replaced with older, slower systems. Ports became congested, schedules slipped, inventories dwindled. The Vrenthar, who prided themselves on their logical and systematic approach to problems, found that their logistics capabilities were perhaps 30% as efficient as they had believed. The other 70% had been human, operating in the spaces between Vrenthar systems, filling gaps that the Vrenthar hadn't even realized existed. Kale Voss spent 3 days in his private chambers after this realization, running simulations, trying to find a way to compensate. The simulations all returned the same result. Full recovery of galactic logistics to pre-withdrawal levels would take approximately 400 years. Unless humans returned. He filed that thought away and did not include it in his report. 5 months after the withdrawal, the Council convened a special session to address what was now being called the cascading failure, a term coined by a Lysara economist who had been studying the supply chain collapse. Ambassador Torvek spoke first. The massive Dorvek shifted his armored bulk on his reinforced platform, his 4 eyes scanning the chamber with the predatory focus that had made his species the apex predators of their high-gravity homeworld. "We must send a delegation to the Terran exclusion zone," he said. "We must negotiate the return of human logistical support." The murmuring that followed was immediate and heated. The Vrenthar delegation shifted uncomfortably. The Lysara delegates chittered among themselves. The representatives of the Serenica, ethereal, energy-based beings who rarely spoke and never in public, pulsed with a faint light that those who knew them recognized as displeasure. "And beg," said Ambassador Siles of the Fenthari, a reptilian species whose pride was exceeded only by their territorial aggression. "We are to beg a species that has been part of this council for less than 300 years, a species that was granted membership as a courtesy, a species that was granted membership," Kale Voss interrupted, "because we had no choice." The chamber fell silent. Kale Voss did not often speak in council sessions. He preferred to observe, to analyze, to understand. But something had shifted in him in the months since the withdrawal, and he found that silence had become untenable. The admission of humanity to the Galaxy Council was not a courtesy, he continued. It was a surrender. We pretended otherwise because the alternative was intolerable to our collective ego, but that does not change the facts. He paused, letting the words settle. In 2471, the human vessel Odyssey entered Vrenthar space without authorization. Our fleet intercepted it. The Odyssey was a survey ship, lightly armed, crewed by fewer than 200 individuals. Our fleet consisted of 47 warships, each one carrying enough firepower to reduce a planet to molten slag. We demanded their surrender. Kale projected the historical recording onto the chamber's holographic display. The tiny human ship dwarfed by the Vrenthar armada. The transmission that followed rendered in the cold, flat tones of the Vrenthar translation matrix. We declined, we have no hostile intent, we are here to explore. If you fire on us, we will defend ourselves. We would prefer not to. The arrogance of it, Sillies hissed. Yes, Kale agreed. The arrogance. That is what we said at the time. We fired on the Odyssey. And what happened next has been classified at the highest levels of every species government for 300 years. I am declassifying it now. He projected another recording. The Vrenthar fleet opened fire. The Odyssey's shields flared, absorbed the barrage, and held. Then the Odyssey returned fire, a single shot from a single weapon. The shot passed through the shields of the Vrenthar flagship as if they did not exist, struck the reactor housing, and disabled the ship without destroying it. 46 remaining warships, 46 more shots, 46 disabled ships, 0 casualties. The humans did not destroy our fleet, Kale said. They disabled it. They then transmitted a message to every Vrenthar world simultaneously, using a communication method we still do not understand, explaining who they were, where they came from, and what they wanted. They wanted trade. They wanted cultural exchange. They wanted to be part of the galactic community. He turned to face the chamber directly. We did not grant them membership out of generosity. We granted it because we realized, in that moment, that we could not stop them from taking whatever they wanted, and the only thing standing between us and annihilation was their preference for peace. So we brought them into the council, gave them a seat, and spent 300 years telling ourselves that we were doing them a favor. The silence that followed lasted nearly 2 minutes. And now they have left, said Overseer Tinnick quietly, not because we defeated them, not because we expelled them, they simply left. Yes, said Kale, and I believe it is time we asked ourselves why. Kale had been asking himself that question for 5 months. He had dedicated more processing power to it than any single question in his 11,000 years of existence, and he had arrived at an answer that disturbed him deeply. He had gone back to the beginning, not to the Odyssey but to the decades before it, to the first human radio transmissions that had leaked into space and been detected by Vrenthar listening posts, to the centuries of observation that followed as humanity progressed from chemical rockets to interstellar travel in a timeframe that should have been impossible. The Vrenthar had watched humanity's rise with growing unease. Every model they ran predicted that a species advancing that quickly would be aggressively expansionist, territorial, and dangerous. It was, after all, what every other fast-developing species in galactic history had been. Rapid technological advancement required intense competition, which bred aggression. It was a law of evolutionary sociology as well established as gravity. But humans didn't follow the law. They fought, yes, their history was drenched in blood, but they also stopped fighting again and again in ways that made no sense to Vrenthar models. They built institutions to prevent conflict. They invested resources in former enemies. They deliberately restricted their own weapons development not because they couldn't build weapons, but because they had decided as a species that some weapons should not exist. And when they reached the stars, they did not conquer. They introduced themselves, politely, with gifts, with genuinely curious questions about other species, other cultures, other ways of being. The Vrenthar models had no framework for this. They had updated the models, rerun the simulations, and arrived at a conclusion that they had kept classified because it was too unsettling to share. Humans were not dangerous because they were aggressive. Humans were dangerous because they were kind. They were dangerous because their capacity for empathy was as vast as their capacity for violence, and they had somehow learned to choose empathy as their default state. This made them unpredictable. It made them impossible to model. And it made them far more terrifying than any aggressive species could ever be. Because an aggressive species you could deter. You could build walls, assemble fleets, establish deterrence protocols. There was a logic to aggression that could be matched with counterlogic. But a species that could destroy your entire fleet and chose not to, that could annihilate your civilization and instead asked to trade. What did you do with that? How did you plan for it? How did you defend against it? You didn't, you couldn't. You simply had to trust that their kindness was genuine, and that trust was the most vulnerable position any species could be in. So the Council had done the only thing it could. It had accepted humanity, integrated them, and then spent 300 years systematically refusing to acknowledge the debt that acceptance implied. It had marginalized human representatives on the Council, relegating them to minor committees and advisory roles. It had ignored human research, dismissed human warnings, and appropriated human innovations without credit. It had treated humans as junior partners in a civilization they could have owned outright. And humans had accepted this. They had accepted it with a patience that the other species mistook for weakness, and that Kale was now beginning to understand was something far more complex. Humans had been watching, observing, learning, not just about the galaxy but about the galaxy's relationship with them, and 5 months ago they had concluded something. Kale requested permission to enter the Terran exclusion zone. The Council debated the request for 6 days. The arguments against it were familiar. The zone was sovereign human territory. Entering without invitation would be a violation of protocol. The humans had made it clear they wanted no contact. The arguments for it were equally familiar. The cascading failure was worsening, the Andrasta rift was still expanding, and someone needed to talk to the humans. The vote passed by a narrow margin. Kale was chosen as the delegation singular because no other species had volunteered to accompany him. He suspected this was less about protocol and more about cowardice. He took a single Vrenthar cruiser, unarmed as a gesture of goodwill, and approached the border of the exclusion zone. The border was marked by nothing. No buoys, no warning beacons, no patrol ships, just empty space. But Kale's instruments could detect what his eyes could not, a spherical shell of sensor networks so sophisticated that they could probably track individual atoms moving within the zone. He transmitted his identity, his purpose, and his request for entry on every frequency he knew. The response came 17 seconds later. A single word in perfect Vrenthar, proceed. His ship passed through the border. For a moment nothing changed. Then his sensors came alive with data. The zone was not empty. It was full of human activity stations, ships, constructions of staggering scale and complexity, but none of it registered on standard sensors. The humans had built an entire hidden civilization in 5 months, existing in parallel with the observable universe, but invisible to any technology the Council possessed. The implications of this made Kale's processing core stutter. He was guided by signals he could detect but not intercept to a point in deep space far from any star. There, floating in the void, was a structure. It was not large by galactic standards, perhaps the size of a small moon. But it was built from materials Kale's sensors could not identify, in configurations that defied his understanding of engineering, and it radiated an energy signature that was unlike anything in the Vrenthar databases. A docking bay opened in the structure's surface. Kale guided his ship inside. He was met in the docking bay by a single human. She was female, of middle age by human standards, wearing a simple garment that appeared to be a uniform of some kind. Her hair was cut short. Her eyes were dark and steady. She stood with the casual confidence that Kale had observed in humans before, that unsettling physical ease that came from evolving on a planet where everything was trying to kill you and you survived anyway. Ambassador Kale Voss, she said. Her Vrenthar was flawless, which itself was remarkable. Vrenthar language relied on subtle crystalline resonance patterns that most species couldn't reproduce with any accuracy. My name is Captain Alina Vasquez. I've been asked to receive you. Asked by whom? Kale said. By the people who asked me to be here when you arrived, Alina said. Which is the same as saying I don't know either, Ambassador. I was told you'd come. I was told to answer your questions honestly. Beyond that, I'm as much in the dark as you are. Kale processed this. It was either an elaborate deception or an illustration of something he had observed many times in human culture. The tendency of humans to trust individual humans with tasks without explaining the broader context. It was, in Vrenthar terms, catastrophically inefficient. In human terms, it apparently worked. Why did you leave? Kale asked. Alina was quiet for a moment, then she gestured toward a corridor leading deeper into the structure. Walk with me, Ambassador, I'll show you something. They walked through corridors that were, to Kale's surprise, not alien in their design. They were human, familiarly, unapologetically human. The floors were made of a material that resembled wood. The lighting was warm, not the cold white preferred by most spacefaring species. The air had a faint scent that Kale's chemical sensors identified as plant-based, flowers perhaps, though his database on human flora was insufficient to identify the specific variety. Why does this look like Earth? Kale asked. Because it's supposed to, Alina said. This whole structure is designed to feel like home, like the home we left behind when we went out into the galaxy. Do you know how long it's been since most humans stood on actual soil, Ambassador? Real soil with real plants growing in it? Generations. We've been living in metal boxes in space for 300 years, adapting to other species' environments, other species' standards, other species' expectations. This place is a reminder of what we are. And what are you? Alina stopped walking. They were in a large open chamber that resembled nothing so much as a park. Real trees grew from the floor, actual biological trees, not holograms or synthetic constructs. Grass covered the ground. A stream ran through the center of the space, its water glittering under warm artificial light. Kale could hear birds. Actual birds, small feathered creatures that wheeled and called in the space above the canopy. We are the species that looked at a universe full of civilizations older and more powerful than ourselves and said, "We'd like to join," Alina said. We were optimistic. Naive, maybe. We thought that if we contributed, if we worked hard, if we were useful, we'd be accepted. Not just tolerated, accepted as equals. You were accepted. Were we? Alina turned to face him. Ambassador, in 300 years, a human was never appointed to lead a single major council committee. Never. Our research was cited in council proceedings fewer times than the research of species with a tenth of our output. Our military was asked to participate in peacekeeping operations but was never given command authority. Our representatives were seated in the middle tiers of the chamber, never near the center. We proposed the Andrasta Rift Containment Protocol, and it was archived without being read. We proposed updates to the docking software that could have prevented the cascading failure, and we were told that our proposals were not aligned with council priorities. We filed 7,000 formal complaints about discrimination over the course of 2 centuries, and every single one was ruled without merit. She said all of this without anger. That was what disturbed Kale the most. He had expected anger, he could have processed anger. What he was hearing was something worse: resolution. The settled, peaceful certainty of a decision made long ago and executed without hesitation. We didn't leave because we were angry, Alina said, as if reading his thoughts. Anger would have been petty. Anger would have meant we still cared about what you thought of us. We left because we realized something important. What? That we don't need you. She led him to another chamber, deeper in the structure. This one was vast, larger than the council chamber itself, and it contained a holographic display of such detail and scale that Kale's sensors initially mistook it for a window. It was a map of the galaxy, not the council's map, which was based on 11,000 years of exploration and survey data. This map was different. It showed things the council's map did not show: hidden connections between star systems, dark matter currents that flowed like rivers through interstellar space, subspace corridors that bent the fabric of reality in ways that made the fastest council hyperdrives look like primitive chemical rockets. What is this? Kale whispered. This is what we've been doing for the past 5 months, Alina said. And honestly, for a long time before that, we've been mapping the galaxy's deep structure, the real structure, not the surface layer that you've been navigating for 11,000 years, but the substrate underneath it. Kale stared at the map. The implications were staggering. If these subspace corridors were real and navigable, travel times between star systems could be reduced by factors of hundreds or thousands. The entire framework of galactic civilization, built on the assumption that distance was the primary limiting factor in interstellar relations, would be rendered obsolete. You could go anywhere, Kale said. Anywhere. Faster than any other species. Much faster. You could have done this at any time. Oh yes. Kale turned to face her. His crystalline body was trembling, a reaction he had not experienced in millennia. You had this technology when you joined the council. No, Alina said. We had the beginnings of it, the theoretical framework. We developed the rest over the past 3 centuries while we were members of the council, while we were being ignored, sidelined, and dismissed. Why didn't you share it? The question hung in the air between them. Alina looked at him with those steady dark eyes, and for the first time, Kale saw something in them that he recognized. Not anger, not sadness, something older and more fundamental. Because you didn't ask, she said. Because in 300 years of working alongside you, of fighting your wars, cleaning up your crises, fixing your systems, and saving your people, not once, not a single time in 300 years did any representative of any species on the Galaxy Council say to a human being, "What do you think? What have you discovered? What can you teach us?" She paused. You saw us as servants, ambassador, useful certainly, competent undoubtedly, but servants not partners, and servants don't share their master's table. Kale had no response to this. His predictive algorithms, which usually provided him with a range of appropriate responses to any social situation, returned nothing. Empty output. A system crash caused by an input that exceeded its capacity to model. We're not angry, Alina repeated. We're not vindictive. We're not planning to conquer you or destroy you or punish you. That's not who we are. But we're done pretending that the relationship was something it wasn't. We're done contributing to a system that takes our labor and gives us nothing but a seat we were told to be grateful for. What do you want? Kale asked. Nothing from you, that's the point. We want nothing from you. We have everything we need and we're building things you can't imagine. We left because we realized that the only thing keeping us in the council was our own willingness to be treated poorly, and we collectively, as a species, every single one of us simultaneously decided that we were done. How? Kale asked. How did you reach a unanimous decision, 700 billion individuals across 12 star systems? No species in history has ever achieved perfect consensus. Alina smiled. It was the first expression of emotion he had seen from her that was not subdued, and it transformed her face in a way that made him understand, intuitively, why humans placed such value on their capacity for emotional expression. We didn't need consensus, she said. We needed connection. You've been studying our communication network, the one that let every ship change course at the same moment. You think it's quantum entanglement. It's the only theoretical framework that. It's not quantum entanglement, Alina said. It's something else, something we've been developing since before we left Earth. A way of connecting human minds directly without intermediaries, without language, without the barriers that normally prevent individuals from truly understanding each other. We call it the resonance. She gestured at the trees, the grass, the stream, the birds. This place is designed to feel like home because every human who enters it feels it as home. Not because it looks like Earth, but because the humans who designed it built it from shared memory from the resonance. Every human who has ever stood on soil, felt sunlight, heard birdsong, that experience exists in the resonance, and it can be shared directly person to person, mind to mind. Kale's processors were struggling. You're connected, all of you, all 700 billion. We're connected, Alina confirmed. Not in a way that erases individuality, we're still ourselves. We still disagree, still argue, still have different opinions and preferences and dreams, but we understand each other completely. When one of us feels pain, we all feel it. When one of us discovers something, we all understand it. When one of us decides something is wrong, we all know it in the same moment with the same clarity. That's why you left, Kale said, because every human knew simultaneously what the council thought of them. Oh yes. And every human agreed simultaneously that it was enough. Oh yes. Kale stood in the artificial forest, surrounded by the products of a connected consciousness that dwarfed anything any species in galactic history had achieved, and he understood something that the Vrenthar had never understood about humanity. Humans were not dangerous because they were kind. Humans were dangerous because they loved each other, completely unconditionally without reservation. And a species that could love like that could do anything, build anything, endure anything. And a galaxy that had such a species in its midst, and chose to treat them as servants rather than equals, had committed a sin so vast that Kale did not have a word for it in any language he knew. Alina walked him back to his ship. The corridors were quiet. The structure hummed around them with the energy of a civilization that had moved beyond the need for external validation. The cascading failure, Kale said as they reached the docking bay. Millions are suffering, the Lysara are dying, the Cathara refugees have nowhere to go. I know, Alina said. Will you help them? Alina was quiet for a long moment. In the resonance, Kale knew that silence was not just hers. It belonged to 700 billion minds, all considering the question simultaneously, all feeling the weight of it together. Not as members of the council, she said, not as subordinates, not as servants. Then as what? As neighbors, she looked at him. When a neighbor's house is on fire, you don't ask what's in it for you. You help them put out the fire, then you go home, you don't move in, you don't take over, you help because helping is what neighbors do. You would help without conditions. One condition, Alina said. The next time a human walks into the council chamber, they sit wherever they want, and no one says a word about it. Kale nodded slowly. It was such a small thing, such an infinitesimally small thing compared to what had happened, compared to what the humans could have demanded, compared to what any other species in their position would have demanded. But that was the point, wasn't it? Humans did not demand, they asked, they offered, they helped, and if you treated them as equals, they would give you everything. If you didn't, they would simply go home and build a universe of their own. Kale Voss returned to the council chamber 7 days later. He walked to the center of the chamber, to the space directly in front of the flame of accord, and he spoke without being recognized by the overseer. I have visited the Terran exclusion zone, he said. I have spoken with the humans, I have seen what they have built, and I am here to tell you that everything we thought we understood about them is wrong. Everything we thought we knew about our place in the galaxy is wrong, and everything we thought we knew about the nature of civilization is wrong. He looked at seat 117, Empty, waiting. The humans did not leave because they were weak, he said. They left because they were strong, stronger than we ever acknowledged, stronger than we were comfortable admitting. They left because they finally realized that the only thing holding them in a system that treated them as inferiors was their own willingness to endure it, and they decided, all of them together in a single moment of shared consciousness, that they were done enduring. He paused. I am proposing that seat 117 be left vacant, not because we are punishing the humans or honoring their withdrawal, but because when they return, and they will return because they are humans and helping is what they do, I want them to see that empty seat and know that we kept it for them. Not because we had to, because we finally learned that it was always theirs, not as a gift from us, as their rightful place in a civilization they helped build and that we let fall apart without them. He looked around the chamber. 741 faces looked back at him. Some were hostile, some were confused, some were afraid. A very few were something else. Something that, in a human, Kale would have called ashamed. The day humanity left the Galaxy Council was the day the universe changed, Kale said. Not because they took something from us, because they showed us what we had been refusing to see, that the galaxy was never held together by our treaties or our fleets or our institutions. It was held together by them, quietly, patiently, without complaint, the way they do everything. He turned back to the flame of accord. Its light flickered as it always had, as it always would, a reminder that even the smallest light could endure if it was tended by hands that cared. We have a choice, Kale said. We can continue as we are, watching the cascading failure deepen, watching the rift expand, watching our civilization unravel thread by thread. Or we can do the thing that every species in this chamber has been too proud to do for 300 years. He faced the chamber one final time. We can ask for help. 6 weeks later, a single human ship emerged from the Terran exclusion zone. It was not a warship. It was not a research vessel. It was a cargo ship, old, battered, patched in a dozen places with materials that didn't match. It looked like a working vessel, the kind of ship that carried freight and supplies and ordinary people doing ordinary jobs. It transmitted a message on standard council frequencies. We're here to help. Where do you need us? The response came not from the council, not from any government or military authority, but from a Lysara medical station on the edge of the Cathara conflict zone. The station was running out of thallium compounds. 3,000 Lysara patients were dying. The station's director, a small, trembling creature who had never spoken to a human before, transmitted a single word in broken standard: please. The human cargo ship altered course. 12 hours later, it arrived at the Lysara station carrying enough thallium compounds to treat every patient. The human crew, 6 ordinary people, none of them soldiers or diplomats, unloaded the cargo themselves, helped the Lysara medical staff distribute it, and then asked if there was anything else they needed. The Lysara director stared at the human captain, a young man with tired eyes and calloused hands, and said, "Why?" The human captain smiled. It was the same smile Kale had seen on Alina Vasquez's face, not triumphant, not condescending, simple, genuine. "Because you asked," he said. In the months that followed, more human ships emerged from the exclusion zone. Not a fleet, not an invasion, just ships, cargo ships mostly, carrying supplies and equipment and expertise. They went where they were needed, they fixed what was broken, they optimized what was inefficient. They trained non-human crews on the logistics systems that had collapsed when they left. They did not ask for payment. They did not demand political concessions. They did not insist on changes to council structure or protocol. They simply helped quietly and efficiently the way they always had. But something was different now. Everyone could feel it. The humans were the same, helpful, competent, unassuming, but there was a new quality to their presence. A boundaries to their generosity that had not been there before. They helped, but they did not stay. They fixed, but they did not manage. They taught, but they did not control. They came, they helped, and they left. Back to the exclusion zone, back to their hidden civilization. Back to the resonance where 700 billion minds shared a connection that no other species could fathom. It was, Kale realized, the human version of distance, the thing they had never had before. For 3 centuries, they had lived in the galactic community with open hearts and open hands, giving everything and asking for nothing. They had been rewarded with condescension and neglect. Now they still gave, but they held something back. They kept a part of themselves apart, protected, inviolate. The resonance, their connection to each other, the thing that made them who they were. They shared it with no one. And the galaxy, which had taken everything else from them and given nothing in return, had no right to ask for it. 1 year after the dissolution declaration, a human representative entered the Galaxy Council chamber for the first time. She was young by human standards, which meant she was perhaps 30 standard years old. She wore no formal diplomatic attire, just the same simple uniform Kale had seen on Alina Vasquez. She walked to seat 117 with a calm, measured stride that 741 pairs of eyes followed in absolute silence. The seat had been left exactly as the last human representative had left it. No one had touched it. No one had suggested moving it or reassigning it. It sat in the middle tier, exactly where it had always been. The young woman stopped in front of the seat. She looked at it for a moment. Then she looked at the center of the chamber, where the most powerful species sat in their ancient seats of authority. And she walked past it. She walked past seat 117, through the middle tier, through the inner tier, to the very center of the chamber. There was one seat there that had been vacant for 11,000 years, the seat of the Council's founding species, the precursors, who had long since transcended physical existence and no longer participated in mortal governance. The seat had been preserved as a monument, never to be occupied again. The young woman sat in it. The chamber erupted. Overseer Tinnick tried to restore order. Ambassador Siles of the Fenthari roared that this was an act of war. Ambassador Torvak of the Dorvak shifted uneasily but said nothing. The Serenica pulsed with light that Kale had never seen before, bright, fast, almost frantic. Through it all, the young woman sat quietly, her hands folded in her lap, her dark eyes calm. When the noise finally subsided, she spoke. This seat has been empty for 11,000 years, she said. It was left empty out of respect for the precursors, who earned it by building the framework that made galactic civilization possible. I'm not sitting in it to claim the precursors' legacy. I'm sitting in it because this is where the humans belong and we're done pretending otherwise. You cannot, Siles began. I can, the young woman said. This seat has no legal protection. No protocol governs its use. No species has claimed it. It is, legally speaking, an open seat, and I am claiming it. On what basis? On the basis that humans have done more for this galaxy in 300 years than any species has done in 11,000, and we're no longer willing to pretend that our contributions are less valuable because we haven't been around as long. She looked directly at Siles. You wanted us to be humble. We were. For 300 years, we were the most humble species in this chamber. We sat where we were told to sit. We spoke when we were told to speak. We accepted every slight, every dismissal, every act of condescension with patience that you mistook for weakness. We're done being humble, not because we've become arrogant, but because we've learned that humility, when it is not met with respect, becomes self-destruction, and we choose life. Kael'Vas watched the young woman sit in the precursor seat and felt something he had never felt before. Not pride, not admiration, not fear, something deeper, something that, if he had been human, he might have called hope. Because she was right, every word. And the fact that it had taken the complete collapse of galactic civilization for anyone to listen was a tragedy that would haunt the Council for generations. But they were listening now. 5 years after the dissolution declaration, the galaxy had recovered. Not fully, recovery would take decades, perhaps centuries, but the immediate crises had been resolved. The Cathara peace accord had been restored, this time with human mediators who were given the authority to enforce it. The Andrasta rift had been contained by human technology that the Council's scientists were still struggling to understand. The cascading failure had been reversed by human logistics systems that were now being openly taught to non-human crews. The human representative in the Council chamber, a rotation of individuals, all chosen through the resonance rather than through political processes that the other species could manipulate, sat in the precursor seat and participated in discussions as an equal. Not as a junior partner, not as an advisor, as an equal. It was, Kale reflected, the minimum that should have been offered from the beginning. He visited the Terran exclusion zone regularly now. Not on official business. There was always official business, always crises to manage, always negotiations to conduct, but on personal business. He went to walk in the artificial forests, to listen to the birds, to sit by the stream and watch the water flow over stones that had been placed there by human hands in patterns designed by human minds, connected by a resonance that he would never experience and could barely comprehend. Elena Vasquez met him each time. They talked about history, about philosophy, about the thousand small things that two beings from different worlds could find in common when they both approached the conversation with genuine curiosity. On one such visit, Kale asked her a question that had been building in his processing core for years. Could you have taken the galaxy if you had wanted to? Elena was quiet for a long time. The stream murmured beside them. The birds called in the canopy above. Yes, she said finally. At any point in the last 300 years, probably in the first week. Why didn't you? Because that's not who we are. But you could have. Oh yes. And you chose not to. Oh yes. Kale turned this over in his mind. It was, he realized, the most terrifying thing about humanity. Not their technology, not their resonance, not their military capability. The most terrifying thing about humanity was that they had the power to rule the galaxy and had chosen, deliberately and collectively, not to use it. That kind of restraint was not weakness. It was the ultimate expression of strength, and it was something that no other species in galactic history had ever demonstrated. "Do you think we've changed?" Kale asked. "The Council, do you think we've learned?" Alina looked at him with those steady dark eyes. "I think you're trying," she said. "And trying is the first step, but it's going to take time, centuries maybe. You spent 300 years treating us as less than equals. You won't unlearn that in 5 years." "And if we don't unlearn it?" Alina smiled. It was the same smile, the simple, genuine, slightly sad smile that seemed to be a universal feature of human expression when confronted with the gap between what was and what could be. "Then we'll still be here," she said. "Helping when you ask, leaving when you don't, building our own civilization in our own way, living our own lives, being who we are." "And who are you?" "We're the species that looks at the universe and sees something worth protecting, not because we own it, not because we control it, because it's beautiful and we're part of it, and that's enough." She stood brushing grass from her uniform, a gesture so absurdly organic and human that Kale felt something warm resonate through his crystalline structure. "Come on, Ambassador," she said. "I'll show you the new gardens. We planted roses this time. I think you'll like them." Kale Voss followed her into the light. The day humanity left the Galaxy Council was the day the universe changed. Not because of what humanity took with them, but because of what they left behind. An absence so vast that it swallowed everything: trade routes, peace accords, supply chains, scientific progress, the quiet, invisible infrastructure of civilization that everyone depended on and no one appreciated until it was gone. But it was also the day the universe learned something about itself. That strength is not the same as dominance. That power is not the same as authority. That the most important members of any community are not the ones who sit at the center and give orders, but the ones who stand in the gaps and hold things together. Humanity had stood in the gaps for 300 years. When they stepped out of them, the gaps became chasms. And the galaxy learned in the most painful way possible that you do not treat the people holding your world together as servants. You treat them as what they are: the most important people in the room. And if they choose to leave, you do not demand they return. You do not threaten them. You do not try to replace them with something lesser and pretend it's the same. You say you're sorry. And then you hope quietly, desperately, with everything you have, that they decide to come back. Not because you deserve it, but because that's who they are. The species that helps. The species that stays. The species that, even after everything, still believes that the universe is worth saving. And saves it. Agains, and agains, and agains, without asking for anything in return. Except perhaps a seat at the table. Not as a gift. As a right. In the council chamber, carved from the heart of a dead star, the flame of accord still burns. It has burned for 11,000 years, and it will burn for 11,000 more. It is a small light in a vast darkness, and it endures not because of the stone that holds it, but because of the hands that tend it. Human hands. Always human hands. Even when no one else noticed. 6 months after Kale Voss's last visit to the exclusion zone, a signal was detected at the edge of council space. It was not a human signal. It was not a signal from any known species. It was a pattern of energy pulses that repeated in a sequence that matched no language in the council's translation databases, a sequence that was, by every measure, alien in the most fundamental sense of the word. The signal originated from beyond the galactic rim, from the void between galaxies, from a place where, according to every model the Council possessed, nothing should exist capable of producing an intelligent transmission. The Council convened an emergency session. Representatives argued about whether the signal was a natural phenomenon, a malfunction of some kind, or something far more concerning. Kale Voss sat in his usual seat and said nothing for the first 3 hours of debate because he already knew the answer. He knew because he had seen the map in Alina's structure, the map of the galaxy's deep structure, the one that showed connections and corridors and currents that the Council had never known existed. That map had not just shown the galaxy's interior, it had shown its edges, and at those edges there had been markings, annotations, labels in human script that Kale's translation matrices had rendered as a single repeated word. Listeners. Kale had asked Alina about the markings during his final visit. She had paused by the stream, her hand resting on the railing of a wooden bridge that had been built for no practical reason other than that someone in the resonance had wanted a bridge over the stream, and had wanted it to be beautiful. They've been out there for a long time, she had said. Longer than the precursors, longer than any species in this galaxy. We detected them about 80 years ago when our deep space sensors became sensitive enough to pick up the faint echoes of their transmissions. They're not transmitting at us specifically. They're transmitting at everything, listening for responses, waiting to see if anyone is home. You didn't tell the council. No. Why? Because the council would have panicked. You would have built fleets and weapons and defense networks, and the noise of all that fear would have drowned out the signal. The listeners are not aggressive, Ambassador. They're patient, impossibly patient. They've been broadcasting for, we estimate, at least 200 million years. Waiting, just waiting. If we had told the council, you would have answered them with fear, and fear is not the answer they're looking for. What is the answer they're looking for? Alina had looked at him then, and her expression had carried something he had never seen on a human face before. Not sadness, not concern, not determination, something quieter, something almost reverent. Understanding, she had said. They want to know that someone is out here who can listen as patiently as they have been broadcasting, someone who can hear the signal and not be afraid of it, someone who can respond not with weapons but with curiosity. Now sitting in the council chamber as the signal pulsed at the edge of known space, Kale understood why the humans had chosen to reveal this information in this way. They had not told the council about the listeners because the council had not been ready. But now, after the withdrawal, after the crises, after the painful process of learning what it meant to rely on a species they had undervalued, now the council was ready. Or at least closer to ready than it had been. Kale stood. The signal is from an extragalactic intelligence, he said, and the chamber went silent. It is not a threat, it is a greeting. It has been broadcast for approximately 200 million years, and it has been detected by human sensors for approximately 80 years. The humans have been studying it, they have been preparing a response, and they are waiting for us to ask them to share what they know. The silence that followed was different from the silences Kale had encountered before in this chamber. It was not the silence of shock or denial or calculation. It was the silence of a room full of beings who had, through great pain and loss, learned a very difficult lesson. Ambassador Siles spoke first. His reptilian features were tight, controlled, but his voice lacked the venom that had characterized every previous reference to humanity. How do you know this? He asked. Because I asked, Kale said. Because I went to them and I asked them what they thought, what they knew, what they had discovered. Because that is what we should have been doing for 300 years. Siles closed his eyes. His species did not have a gesture equivalent to a sigh, but the slow deflation of his scaled frills communicated the same sentiment. I move, Siles said quietly, that the council formally request human assistance in responding to the extragalactic signal. There was no objection. The human response was characteristically simple. A small team, 4 individuals, none of them diplomats or military officers, arrived at the council's primary communications array within a week. They carried with them a device roughly the size of a human hand, constructed from materials that the council's scientists could not identify. They connected the device to the array. They calibrated it using interfaces that they had designed to be compatible with council technology, interfaces that were intuitive, well-documented, and accompanied by training materials that had clearly been prepared in advance. They were prepared, they had always been prepared. For this moment, for this signal, for the possibility that the galaxy would one day need them to do something that no other species could do. Captain Alina Vasquez was not among the 4, but she had sent a message to Kale, transmitted through the same unknowable channel that connected all human minds. They've been waiting 200 million years for someone to say hello. We're going to say hello for you, not because we're better than you, because we've been practicing. Humanity spent 50,000 years on a single planet learning to talk to each other before we could talk to anyone else. We're good at first contact. It's what we do. But here's the thing, Ambassador. When the listeners respond, and they will respond because 200 million years of patience tells us they want nothing more than to be heard, we're not going to be the ones who continue the conversation. We're going to introduce you, all of you, every species in the council, because the listeners don't want to talk to us. They want to talk to the galaxy, to the whole community of sentient life. We're just the ones who happened to be listening when you weren't. So this is what's going to happen. We're going to send the first message. Then we're going to step back, and you're going to have to do the thing you've never done before. You're going to have to speak for yourselves. We'll be right here if you need us, we always will be, but it's time for you to stand at the front, Ambassador, not behind us, beside us, or if you're willing to be brave, ahead of us. The universe is bigger than any of us knew, and it's time we all walked into it together. Kale read the message 3 times. Then he saved it in the most secure archive he possessed, not because it contained secrets but because he wanted to ensure that it survived. that future generations of Vrenthar and Lysara and Dorvac and every other species that would inherit the galaxy could read it and understand. Understand that the humans had not left because they stopped caring. They had left because they cared too much, and caring in a system that did not care back was destroying them. They had withdrawn to heal, to connect, to become whole. And now, whole and strong and certain of who they were returning, not to rule, not to dominate, but to walk beside. And to remind the galaxy that walking beside someone was not weakness. It was the hardest, bravest, most important thing a species could do. The message was sent on a Tuesday, or at least it was a Tuesday by Earth's ancient calendar. The detail seemed to matter to the humans, though Kale could not fathom why. The four-person team activated the device, and a signal pulsed outward from the Council's communications array directed at the source of the extragalactic transmission. The signal was not in any Council language. It was not in Vrenthar or Dorvac or Lysara. It was not even in Standard. It was in a language that the humans had constructed specifically for this purpose, a language built from mathematical principles that any sufficiently advanced intelligence would recognize as deliberate and intentional. It said, in essence, "We hear you, we are here, we are many. We are different from each other, but we are together. We would like to know you." 17 days later, the listeners responded. The response was not a signal, it was a presence. Something moved at the edge of the galaxy, something vast beyond comprehension, something that made the largest council dreadnought look like a mote of dust, something that existed in dimensions that Kale's sensors could detect but not fully perceive. It did not enter the galaxy. It paused at the boundary, like a traveler arriving at a door and waiting to be invited in. The council chamber was in an uproar. Representatives were shouting, fleeing, calling for fleets, demanding weapons. Kale Voss stood in the center of the chaos and looked at the human team, who were sitting calmly in the visitors' gallery, watching the proceedings with expressions of patient attention. Captain Vasquez's message had said they would step back. They were stepping back. This was the Council's moment, the galaxy's moment. The moment when every species that had ever called this galaxy home had to stand together and face something that none of them could face alone. Kale walked to the center of the chamber. He stood before the flame of accord and raised his hand, a gesture he had learned from humans who used it to request silence and who had taught it to the rest of the galaxy without anyone realizing it was a human custom. The chamber fell silent. "The thing at the edge of our galaxy has waited 200 million years for this moment," Kale said. "It has waited longer than our civilization has existed, longer than the precursors existed, longer than some of the stars in this chamber were born. It is patient, it is vast, and it is waiting for us to respond." He looked at the holographic display that showed the presence at the galactic rim. It was beautiful, in a way that transcended the aesthetic frameworks of any species present. It shimmered with light that existed in spectrums most of them couldn't see, pulsed with energy that resonated on frequencies most of them couldn't hear, and occupied a shape that most of them couldn't fully perceive. It was, Kale thought, what the universe looked like when you stopped being afraid of it. "We are going to respond," Kale said. "Not with weapons, not with fear, with curiosity, with openness. With the same quality that the humans showed us when they first arrived in this galaxy and that we failed to reciprocate for 300 years. He turned to face the chamber. "The humans taught us many things, logistics, medicine, engineering, but the most important thing they taught us is the simplest. They taught us that the universe is not something to be conquered or controlled or feared. It is something to be approached with open hands and an open mind. They taught us this not by telling us but by showing us every single day for 300 years while we were too proud to see it." He paused. "We see it now." Kale Voss, ambassador of the Vrenthar, one of the oldest sentient beings in the galaxy, walked to the communications console and opened a channel to the presence at the edge of the galaxy. 741 species watched. 4 humans watched from the gallery. 700 billion humans watched through the resonance. And somewhere in the deep structure of the universe, in the substrates of reality that humans had mapped and other species had never known existed, something that had been alone for 200 million years heard a voice say, "Welcome, please come in, we have been waiting for you. Not as long as you have been waiting for us, but long enough to know that waiting is easier when you are not alone. We are not alone anymore. Neither are you." The presence entered the galaxy, slowly, carefully, with a gentleness that belied its incomprehensible scale. It moved through the stars like a whale through an ocean, massive, ancient, and deliberate, disturbing nothing, leaving no wake, simply being present in a way that made every being who perceived it feel for a moment that the universe was larger and more wondrous than they had ever dared to imagine. And at the center of it all, in a chamber carved from the heart of a dead star, a flame still burned. It had burned for 11,000 years. It would burn for 11,000 more. And for the first time in the history of the Galaxy Council, the hands that tended it were not alone. They never had been. They had simply been waiting for the rest of the galaxy to notice.